Joe?
Yes, ma'am.
Two, one.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I now call this meeting of the Finance Committee to order. Today is September 23rd, 2020. The time is now 6 p.m. exactly. 5 p.m. exactly, pardon me. In attendance is myself, Board Chair, Ms. Brown, Committee Member. Not in attendance is Mr. Lombard, who informed me earlier that he would not be able to make it before I scheduled the meeting. I went ahead and scheduled it anyway with his permission, so it's not a reflection on him for his presence not being here. Also in attendance is Mr. Albert Benahan, board member, Ms. Siegel, staff, CFO, Mr. Nick Fusco, and Ms. Liz Mauer. And
I didn't introduce myself.
And
The dear Director Grant is also here. I was muted when I came on. I'm sorry.
I'm Ms. Clark, and also present.
Hello, everyone.
First item on the agenda is approval of minutes dated June 10th, 2020. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
And I will second it. I see no material errors or omissions. If Ms. Brown has any, do you have anything, Ms. Brown?
None at all.
Any errors you see, Mr. Benahan, by any chance?
No, sir. Everything's fine. Thank you.
Okay, that being said, all in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Minutes are approved. Next item up on the agenda is an update on COVID-related revenues and expenditures. This is in conjunction with our grant funding. Ms. Siegel, before you begin, can you give an explanation between the difference between grant funds and operating funds before you go into your thing? Because there seems to be some confusion amongst the citizenry that these care grant funds could be used for operating costs going forward, and they're like a bonanza of cash for us.
Yes. So first, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
In regard to the difference between the operating budget and various grants, the operating budget is derived from state allocations of ECS funding and city revenue. So the operating budget has a state share and a city share. And these revenues are basically derived from tax revenues and other forms of revenue collection at the state and the city level. And the operating funds are utilized to provide the resources for the overall operation of the school district, and in general can be used for any purpose related to general operations. When we receive a grant, which can come from a federal grant source or a state grant source or a private grant source, a grant has specific guidelines related to a specific purpose. And we are required to comply with those guidelines. And in our reporting to the grant source, we are required to demonstrate that we have utilized the funding in accordance with the approved application, and the approved application is based upon the applicable guidelines. And so in the case of the CARES Act grant and the CRF grant, CRF is Coronavirus Relief Grant. In the case of each of those grants, as is true for any grant, there are specific guidelines and requirements. And so the CARES Act has priorities which were identified by the Commissioner of Education in relation to the federal guidelines that were enacted as part of the federal legislation. So to recap for everyone, those priorities are ensuring that all students have access to appropriate technology and connectivity, accessibility to high-quality curriculum that addresses the needs of all learners, including students with disabilities, addressing student learning gaps and safely reopening schools, and providing social and emotional supports for educators and students as they transition back to school. And so our budget plan incorporates supplemental personnel services, compensatory special education services, personal protective equipment, of course, curriculum and technology renewal on a digital platform, and equitable access to technology for distance learning. The Coronavirus Relief Grant, known as CRF, in its shortened version, is a grant that the state has made to the school districts utilizing funds that were appropriated by the federal government to help alleviate the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. And those funds have to be used in specific categories. And for Bridgeport, well, the categories are the same for every district, but I'm looking at the table of categories. The funding that was allocated to Bridgeport falls into the following categories: academic personnel supports, student supports under the general category of personnel related supports, cleaning, PPE, health and safety. And then in the non-personnel related support category, there are two subcategories: cleaning, PPE, health and safety, and then transportation. So for that grant, we received funding in 5 areas, which are highlighted in the summary document that I shared with you. right? So in brief, returning to your original question, the CARES Act funds and the CRF grant cannot be used for general operating expenses. You would not be able to use these funds, as an example, to fund the salaries of school principals. You wouldn't be able to fund the salaries of let's see, salaries of clerical staff, as an example. And it should be utilized for the additional services that have become necessary in order to reopen schools safely and effectively.
Okay, thank you. Before you go on, I would like the record to reflect Chairman John Weldon has entered the meeting.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, I was just mentioning that John Weldon entered the meeting. Before you go on, I just wanted to make that noted for the record. And could you walk us through the expenditures on the two different grants, please?
Yes, so I'm going to put it up on the screen.
Perfect.
All right. Can you see the document?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, very good. So first I'm going to scroll down and just highlight in the bottom section in the notes that we're showing in this section that the CARES Act grant for our public schools is $8,726,522. The original allocation was approximately $9.1 million. The non-public schools were entitled to receive $423,963, and so the Bridgeport amount is $8,726,522. Now, also important to note about the CARES Act is that it expires on September 30th, 2022. And therefore, any funds that are not expended in the current year can be rolled over into the new fiscal year, which will be 21-22. And in fact, the period from July of 2022 to September 30th of 22 will be in the subsequent fiscal year. So these funds are actually going to cross the next two fiscal years, with only 3 months in the final fiscal year. So we're going to be leveraging all of our resources to the greatest extent possible, which means that if we can fund a particular need in another fund source, and that perhaps has to be spent by a certain time, and enroll money in the CARES Act, we will do that. We don't know how long this pandemic will last, and any additional grant sources of funding are unknown at this time. So we have to optimize the utilization of our available resources and leverage our resources to the optimal extent. Now, moving on to the CRF grant. So this grant is $4,795,113, and this grant expires December 31st, 2020, which is coming soon. So these funds are basically being utilized in the period from July 1st through December 31st. And the categories that I mentioned a few moments ago are listed in the bottom section, and you can see the amounts in each section. These amounts represent the allocations made by the state, and we intend to expend fully in each of those areas based on our current plans. Now, in the document, in the upper section, I want to highlight that this is a work in progress. We work with this every day. We update it every day as appropriate. Some days there won't be any updates, other days there will be. And I mentioned earlier that we may be using other fund sources for certain needs, and so the numbers are going to be modified as we move through the school year. Also, the document represents not only items already encumbered and expended, but also committed. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we look first in the top section, we see it's labeled fiscal year 20, which is 1920. So that's last fiscal year. And you can see that we have items in that section charged off to the CARES Act, which is column I. So at that time, we didn't have the CRF grant. We did have the CARES Act grant, and we charged $1,136,157. Now, you'll also notice that we included a column G for PPE. So the first 4 items are PPE. And we did submit for FEMA reimbursement for PPE for the first quarter, which was the March to June 2020 period. And we're hopeful that the requests will be approved and we will receive 75% reimbursement. So the numbers that we're recording for PPE reflect the original amount of the order. So for example, the first item is face masks, $250,000. That was the cost of the face mask. That is the amount that is in the chart. We're hopeful we will receive 75% reimbursement. If we do, the 75% will go back into the CARES Act, and the cost of that of the supply will be adjusted accordingly. Now in fiscal year 20, those are expenditures already made, so we're going to leave those expenditures as is. But if we receive the FEMA reimbursement for the fiscal year 20 expenditures, we'll treat those reimbursements as credits, and we'll record the credits in the fiscal year 21 section. Now, FEMA changed its rules about 2 to 3 weeks ago, and they announced that they were no longer going to approve 75% reimbursement for PPE for school districts, for PPE purchased after September 15th. We expended for PPE approximately $2 million in total in the March to June period and July to the current day. So we're hopeful that we will receive 75% reimbursement on all or most of those items, since most of those items were expended prior to September 15th. Now, in the bottom section, we have 2021, starting July 1st, 2020. And here again, you can see in column G, PPE, and expenditures charged to CARES and expenditures charged to CRF. Right. Now, I have a number of items listed that are coded as projected because we're anticipating either making those charges and the charges haven't occurred yet, or because we're anticipating a certain amount for a particular service, such as psychologists or speech or nurses, and we expect to reach a certain level but we haven't reached that level yet. And so, once again, the numbers will represent both expenditures, actual expenditures, meaning services or supplies received, and commitments for expenditures. So, for example, in the area of transportation, we have transportation expenses here that for $650,000, and I have a note here that was part of our budget plan, which we'll further discuss when we reach the 2021 GAP plan. But if you recall, we did not receive the full amount of money that we requested from the city for continuation of the transportation limits in 2021. So we were short $650,000. We will be able to charge $650,000 of appropriate transportation expenditures in the CRF grant because we will have expenditures that we can classify as related to providing appropriate transportation for students in a socially distanced environment to and from school in order to maintain safety. And then the second line is approximately 1.3 million. And so if you add these two lines, 650,000 and 1348527, that is equal to, scrolling down, equal to the transportation line where the total is 1998527. Okay. Now we haven't received an invoice yet for transportation. We're in our third week of school. So clearly we haven't made any transportation charges yet to the CRF grant. But I included in our summary chart the commitments of expenditures for those services. Right? So in summary, we have a grand total for expenditures and commitments, approximately 9.2 million. Our grand total for both grants combined is about 13.5. So currently the balance is 4.3. That is prior to FEMA reimbursement. So hopefully we'll be getting approximately 1.5 million in FEMA reimbursement, but that will not arrive in one sum. Most of the money for most of the PPE expenditures occurred in the July to September period. And so we're getting ready to complete our application and submit it to the city in early October. And then the city will file that application in presumably in October, by the end of October. And then it takes time at the federal level to process the application. Keep in mind they're receiving these applications for every school district in the country, and every school district in the country expects to apply for the same types of reimbursement that we do. And so it could take several weeks or months before we see any of the reimbursement flow in. Are there any questions?
Yes, Ms. Siegel, I got a couple of things. About
Yes.
the non-public school allocation. There was a recent change of the private schools. Did that affect our inflows any, and is it reflected in the document?
The non-public school allocation is final. There was some concern at the state level about the interpretation of federal guidance. But at this point, we were notified that the rule that the U.S. Department of Education was attempting to modify, that rule was not upheld in the courts. And so the amount that we have recorded is based on the Title I methodology and corresponds to the final calculation that the state made.
Okay, my next question is, thank you. My next question is, the early childhood support teams, you got 45 positions. Are those all currently filled or are they in progress?
Unfortunately, no. Staffing during a pandemic has proven to be extremely challenging. Now, as you know, we're working with our contracted agency, Delta T, to secure paraprofessionals. We're working with our contracted agency, Kelly Educational Services, to secure substitute teachers. And both agencies in their respective areas have encountered severe obstacles to filling positions in a timely way. They are working vigorously in a focused way to exhaust every possible effort. I'm remaining hopeful and optimistic that over the next few weeks they will be able to increase the numbers. At last count, out of the 45, there were 21 filled. And even within the 21, we've been encountering various types of issues. For example, individuals who, you know, they may not arrive on a particular day. Maybe they had an issue with a family member, or they had they were waiting for their COVID tests and couldn't report. So there are numerous issues that are impacting at this early point in the school year on not only filling a position, but maintaining someone in the position consistently. So that is the reality that we are confronting. But I do know that both Kelly and Delta for paras, Kelly for teachers, are working to utilize every possible means to fill open positions.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to now turn it over to Ms. Bobby Brown. Do you have any questions on this portion?
I just have a question about two things. I don't know if you mentioned it, about the nurses. I know that was a concern with school-based nurses. How does that fit into our budget?
Well, we have obtained nurses through various agencies. Our supervisor of nursing, Lizette Early, has been successful after a tremendous effort to secure nurses from Delta T, Soliant, and the Nurse Network. So I have 5 indicated on the charts. I believe at this point she's fully staffed or almost fully staffed. There may be one additional line open that we had planned to fill.
Okay, and then the last question, I'm still learning like how everything lines up. So there was a big confusion with some of our community leaders and those that were in the community about the surplus of the 4.1. Now, I know you was breaking down everything, but if you could just break that down one more time for the record so that people understand how that money is divided for our district, just with the surplus, if you didn't already touch on it fully.
I'm not, are you referring to this document? If you're referring to the operating budget, we'll cover the surplus in the next section, the budget gap plan.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
I think she's talking about the excess COVID-related funds and how they could, are they going to be like, because I mean, we need less than 4 million less next fiscal year.
Correct.
Oh, you mean if we don't utilize all of the funds in the current year? Is that the question?
Yes.
Oh, well.
Yes. And what?
CARES
go ahead.
Act expires September 30th, 2022. So when a grant award is made and the end date is beyond the last day of the current fiscal year, then that means that any unused funds at the end of the fiscal year can be carried forward to the next fiscal year. So we were given an allocation after, net of non-public schools, approximately $8.7 million. So we don't have to spend $8.7 million by June 30th of 2021. If we've expended $5 million by June 30th of 21, then we would have a balance of approximately 3.7 million, and we will carry that forward into the new year. There's certainly the possibility that in 2021-22, the next fiscal year, we may still need to order PPE. We may still need to have a replenishment plan for computer devices, because some of our, although we've secured an enormous number of new devices, there may be some older devices that are reaching the end of their life cycle. And so those are some examples. So we want to conserve our resources so that we have funding for next year, because we don't know whether there's going to be another source of funding. Will there be another COVID relief bill passed by the, by the Congress? We can't necessarily rely on the expectation of another relief bill with additional funding. So we're going to spend wherever we need to spend. Our standard policy as part of deficit prevention is to expend funds only for services that are absolutely necessary and essential, and then we roll the funds into the following year. We do have to expend all of the funds by September 30th of 2022.
Okay, Ms. Siegel, let me make a follow-up question, please. If those funds aren't expended they must be expended on COVID-related charges for the most part, correct?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
Well, first of all, they must be expended on COVID-related expenses.
Yes, they must be expended in compliance with the requirements of the grant.
And should the grant expire and for some strange reason, which you never do not expend all the money allocated to us, what happens?
We always expend all of our funds by the expiration date.
And you do an excellent job.
If the hypothetical question is, suppose you have suppose a district hasn't expended $1 million of their grant and the grant expires, well, then they have to return the $1 million to the fund source.
Thank you. Ms. Brown, do you have anything else?
Nope, I have no other questions. Thank you.
So we, just as a general rule, we expend all of our funds wherever we can, meaning wherever we have valid expenditures or valid services that are aligned with the guidelines of the grant, we expend fully all the funds.
Thank you. Now I'll turn it over to other board members. Mr. Benahan, you've got a question?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you, Mr. Joe. Mrs. Siegel, you say in the beginning that FEMA changed the rules, like about 70% they don't want to do it no more. They give you the reason and why they don't want to be involved anymore?
Well, this was reported in a newspaper article, and I think the reason is they can't afford to continue to reimburse school districts at the rate of 75%, considering the magnitude of the expenditures across the country. So I think that the change in the rule was driven by monetary factors. As to the rationale that they gave, according to the newspaper article, they were citing that FEMA reimbursement is intended for emergency expenditures well, let me say it this way, expenditures for emergency measures in relation to, a crisis, the crisis in this case being the COVID pandemic. And they no longer regard PPE as an emergency measure after a certain period of time. So that's the rationale that I believe they are citing. I believe that the monetary factor is driving the rationale that they articulated.
And can you, I'm sorry to ask you it again, but I was a little confused when you said transportation with the city canceled something. I was a little lost in that part. Can you explain me a little bit? Because so far I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the city would have given, a good amount for, for us for the transportation or not. So you say something about that. Can you explain me a little bit in short word, please?
I believe you're referring to the fact that in 2019-20, the city contributed $1.4 million in a direct payment to WeTransport. And in our budget process, we requested that they continue to contribute $1.4 million. We requested that $1.4 million be added to our budget as part of the MBR, minimum budget requirement. They did not agree. They did provide a monetary allocation, meaning an increase to the MBR of $2 million generally, and then they added $250,000 more to the MBR, if you recall, specifically for transportation. And then they said they would make a direct payment of $500,000 to the transportation company. So we added $250,000, which was in the MBR, to $500,000 in a direct payment. The total is $750,000. We subtract that from 1.4 million, and the balance is 650,000, and that was the balance that we were missing in our gap plan. But we are able to charge transportation expenditures, appropriate transportation expenditures in the CRF grant because measures have been taken on our bus routes to ensure that the maximum number of students is not exceeded. And so we will be able to leverage our resources to the benefit of the district.
All right, thank you, Mr. Go. I appreciate that. I have no more questions, Mr. Joe, for this moment, but I will mail you, Mr. Joe, some questions because we don't want to be all night about this budget, but no more questions, Mr. Joe. Thank you.
Well, we have much more to cover.
Mr. Weldon?
No questions.
Okay, Ms. Siegel, if you could go into the next agenda item, the 1920. Have we finished out that year?
Yes. Let's go back to my notes. All right. So what I want to do first is bring up the other document, and then I'll have some introductory remarks. So just bear with me for a moment. All right, so with the budget gap plan as a backdrop, I just have a few opening remarks. I'll try to be brief, and then we'll go through the gap plan for 2021, which builds on the 1920 condition. So I'm actually going to cover 1920 and 2021 as an interrelated, cohesive whole. Okay?
Sounds like a great plan.
All right. So for 1920, we completed the end of year close by August 31st, as we're required to do. The June 30th, 2020 financial condition report was posted. The state education finance system reports were filed on time by September 1st. And those reports, which are unaudited, have now been posted to the website. The annual audit is underway by Blum Shapiro and will be completed by December 31st. And the final EFS reports will then be filed by December 31st, after which the final reports will be posted to the website. In addition to posting the financial condition report and the unaudited EFS reports, we also posted, as we do every year, the school allocation model as of September 1st. Let's keep in mind that it can change if needs change. And the budget plan, which could change on a daily basis as we adjust budget lines to meet changing needs. All right, so now I want to start by mentioning the 2021 opening condition, and then I'm going to relate that to the end of year 1920 condition. So the district ended 1920 with a surplus, which I will explain in detail when we review the 2021 budget gap plan in a few minutes. And that gap plan, which is on the screen, incorporates the analysis of the end of year 2019-20 condition and the 2021 condition. In summary, the 2021 budget is structurally balanced with carryover surplus funds of approximately, as you'll see in a moment, 6.7 million on reserve for withdrawal by the district when we needed to balance the budget. Now, approximately 3.2 million of that number is already committed. That 3.2 is applied to the 2021 budget to achieve structural balance. By the way, structural balance means that we believe, based on our planning, that our expenditures will be under or equal to our revenues. But clearly, we monitor the budget continuously throughout the year because variables that impact the budget condition can modify projections at any time and structurally unbalance a budget, in which case we have to intervene and take appropriate actions to try to return a budget to balance. But at this point, we're focused on structural balance, which at this time we have. And so 3.2 million is already committed, and that 3.2 million is in addition to the pre-18-19 surplus of $2 million in the ISF, which was already part of the GAP plan. So I know this can get complex, but I've mentioned this many times in the past. Prior to the introduction of the Connecticut Partnership Health Plan in 1819, there was a surplus of funds in the Internal Service Fund. And that amount is approximately $2 million. And we have been able, fortunately, to carry that forward, meaning we didn't need to use it. We had intended to use it in 1920. We thought we would need it to balance the budget when the school year began. But when COVID struck in mid-March and we had the school closure, while we had significant needs, we also were able to realize savings. And so in the end, we didn't need to utilize the 2 million. That 2 million still exists and belongs to the district. It is unreserved in the internal service fund. And it is part of the 1920 budget plan. So when we wrote the it's part of the 2021 budget plan, the 2021 budget plan. So when we wrote the 2021 plan, we built in the $2 million of pre-1819 ISF surplus on the premise that we were anticipating we probably would not need it in 1920. We didn't know we wouldn't need it until the end of 1920. All right. So the balance of the carryover surplus is approximately 3.5 million, 6.7 minus 3.2. And that's on reserve in the internal service fund, available for withdrawal when we need it. We anticipate that we're going to have to apply it to close a 21-22 budget gap. So in the end, when all is done, as we'll see when we go through the document, when all is done, we expect that, we actually have approximately $3.5 million more than we had anticipated we would have, before the pandemic struck. All right, now there are multiple variables that are going to impact the 2021 budget in relation to the original plan. And I'll come back and speak briefly about those variables after we review the gap plan. Is everyone with me before I review the gap plan?
Yeah.
Any initial questions before I go on? I know it's complex, so I want to ask first.
Yeah, I just want to go. Actually, not on that thing. Just on. You said it was audited by Blum and Shapiro. Do we post that audit? Because there's a thought process in the city that we just willy-nilly do our books and nobody looks at them.
The city. Well, the Blum Shapiro is the auditing firm contracted by the city, and they produce the audit. There's a standard letter, it's called a representation letter, that is generated on December 31st, and I believe there's mention of the audit in the CAFR, but other than that,
Marlene, just so everybody's clear, that information, the CAFR, is on the city's website by year. So every CAFR is put on the city's website.
Okay.
Can we know?
Okay,
can we know who was the first on speak, please?
Oh no. That was
Liz.
Thank you. Ms. Mauer, yeah.
Oh, because I know we
Mr.
got the
Wilson,
numbers, but we don't know who's the person.
That was Ms. Mauer. Mr. Weldon, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to say I've spoken about this with Mr. Testani, and this fact is never talked about generally, that we are a part of an audit, and somebody passes judgment on our finances as part of the overall city's audit, and perhaps when the CAFR is available, we can place a link to it somewhere on our website in the appropriate section, and maybe even, and it may cost us to do it, but I've seen other agencies do it. Maybe we can have, when the final audit report is done, maybe we can have Blum Shapiro come and give a hour-long presentation to the board about the kind of work they did, how they did it, and give people an understanding of how they've come to have the opinion they have on at least the district's finances. I don't know, again, we may need to pay for something like that because it's a little out of the scope of the work, but perhaps it could be done. And then to your point, Mr. Skalovic, people would see that, our finances don't just operate in an abyss. that nobody's ever looking at.
And that was actually my point too. As to I was talking to Mrs. Cullivant recently, and I felt like, you know, everyone's always screaming transparency, transparency, but when you give transparency, and if people don't understand what they're even looking at, can confuse everyone altogether. So that's why, Ms. Siegel, I brought up the 4.1 because I wanted to make sure it was clear to those that may be viewing this or whatever, that they have an idea of the difference between what the city gets versus what the Board of Ed gets, and how that looks like even with COVID factored into everything that's going on.
I agree with Mr. Warden saying.
All right.
Again, just something to explore. You know, we don't have privity of contract with Blum Shapiro. It's the city's audit arrangement, but perhaps we could make some sort of an arrangement where, you know, representatives of Blum Shapiro could just come in and give almost like an everyman's version presentation, just so people see. I hear people talk about forensic audits. We need an audit. Well, we get an audit every year, and we always get a clean opinion or clean, unqualified opinion. So I think that fact should be spotlighted.
You have a great point, Mr. Warden. A very great point.
All right. Should I continue?
Yes, ma'am. Unless anybody got anything else on this first portion? Hearing none, go ahead, Ms. Siegel.
All right, thank you. So looking at the GAP plan, looking at the top first, you'll see that we started with our initial monetary need of 14.5 million. And then in the first section, we have the revenue and savings. So I'm going to try and move through this quickly in the interest of time, because I do have significant content to cover. In the revenue section, we have the Alliance ECS additional funding. Now, we learned of this funding on July 13th, and it's about 2.3 million. It was 536,000 lower than we originally anticipated. So clearly we had to make up for that loss, and we're able to do that with the funding we have in the CARES Act, because we can fund our building subs and our long-term subs that are needed for COVID-related illness to the CARES Act and also the CRF grant. So that's 2.3 million. And then the priority grant, which has three parts: the main grant, the summer, and extended school hours, ESH. That was higher by 58,204. So that was good news. It's not 500,000, but nevertheless good news. And then the city revenue consisted of 2,250,000 added to the MBR, 500,000 in a direct payment to We Transport that will be made, has not yet been made, and you'll recall that the city waived the payment for the SROs, and so that gave us almost 3.2 million toward the monetary need. All right, now moving ahead, I put in a section on adjusted expenses and also savings. So on the adjusted expenses, we have a deduction of 962,590. So what is that? Well, every year we have to make a contribution to the ISF, our ISF, for the various expenditures related to retirees. So this, of course, relates to the health insurance and all of the health services that they have. Now, the original forecast, based on the original Siegel report, no relation to me, but the SEGAL consulting report, was about $1 million. And it turned out that the city transferred $2 million. So the money belongs to us. It was transferred out of our budget into the ISF. It's in our ISF. We have seen it. We're tracking it. It's our money. If the funds aren't needed, meaning if another surplus occurs in the ISF, we will benefit from that surplus. However, in the budget plan, I'm short those funds. So I have to account for that up front. So that's the reason for listing this number. Then food and nutrition, which we'll discuss in a few moments, we were actually able to reverse a shortfall, projected shortfall, and turn that into a surplus. So we actually had a surplus in food and nutrition. It's about $900,000. But I was informed that there's a pending liability that may or may not materialize, but it could materialize, and so we have to take it into account for personnel who may be due payment during the period of school closure, and that's about $200,000. Again, it's not certain, but it could materialize. And then I've spoken to you about the AFSCME contract, which is still not approved. And at this point, the AFSCME employees have missed a July 1st, 2019 increase and a July 1, 2020 increase. So the funding that we saved in 1920, we now have to account for as a retroactive charge in 2021. And then we do have additional expenses in special ed. This figure of 300 is preliminary. It's probably low. Special ed expenses may grow higher due to new classes and the related staffing, various types of special ed services. And so we are taking that into account. And then savings. So we're including the $2 million that I mentioned previously. Excuse me. I just have to have some water. All right. So we're including the $2 million that I mentioned previously, which is the pre-1819 surplus that fortunately we didn't need to use in 1920. It's still available. It's our money, and we're applying that to close the gap. And then we had, beyond the $2 million, a surplus that I mentioned of about $6.6 million. So we're going to drop that surplus in, and then we're going to apply all of our other gap resolution actions, and then we're going to see where we land, and we're going to land at the number that I shared with you previously, where we're approximately 3.5 million ahead, meaning 3.5 million in surplus beyond what we originally needed, right? So we drop that in and we land with a gap balance of about $2 million. Now, we're going to be in deficit prevention mode. We're always in deficit prevention mode. That doesn't mean we're at absolute austerity. It basically means, as I said earlier, that we make purchases only when services are absolutely essential, absolutely necessary, and we do so with optimal cost effectiveness. So if someone leaves a position and we determine we no longer need that position, we're not going to fill it just to have it filled. We're going to save those funds. So deficit prevention mode has various components. You've heard me speak about this previously. I'm not going to take time unless I'm asked a question to go over all the components, but they are documented in this template for you. So that's about $2.1 million. And then we have various program adjustments, the position consolidation, school administrators, the adjustment of the 12-month AP positions upon attrition to 10-month positions. And all of these items I covered previously. We're just carrying them forward because we took these actions in the interest of prudence, in the interest of making the best decisions for the school district. And so all of these actions help to balance the budget. Now, I mentioned earlier the Alliance ECS allocation was about $500,000 lower than, sorry, one moment, I just need to close this. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that Alliance was about $500,000 lower than originally anticipated, but we're able to compensate for that because we have the CARES Act, and we have expenditures in the teacher subcategory that qualify for funding under CARES. And meaning they're related to the COVID pandemic. And so we're able to compensate through the CARES Act. And then we have some projected savings in transportation due to the amended school calendar from 182 days to 177 days. And the reason that I included that item now in the plan is because if I scroll down to item 9, you'll see the state magnet grant was originally projected to be at a higher level. We thought that in 2021 the enrollment would be higher and grant revenue would grow. The current projections of enrollment indicate lower revenue with a loss of about 141,000. Now it's not October 1st yet. We're waiting to review the enrollment data, and I'm hopeful that if there is a loss that it's not more than 141,000. But at this point, based on the original numbers in early September, actually before school opened, based on Power School numbers, we projected a lower amount of magnet grant revenue. And so where we had originally a gain, I now had to put in a loss. And I just rounded the 141 to 150 just to use a round number. So we have to cover that loss, and since we were originally projecting 200,000 as a gain, we were actually covering about 300,000 in loss. But we expect to make up for that through the transportation savings. All right. So. I spoke about the 650,000 for transportation, and I summarized in the center section the basis for the 650,000, which I also explained earlier in response to a question. And so when we take into account all of those factors, we land at 3.4 million positive surplus. And scrolling down, I noted that this amount is deposited in the internal service fund. It's our money, it's on reserve, and we can withdraw it in fiscal year 21 if we need it, or a future year to balance the budget. Now, I want to go back and reemphasize that while that $3.5 million is on reserve, we are removing $2 million in our plan. We've included $2 million from the ISF from the pre-1819 surplus. Okay, and in addition to that 2 million, we used in this plan about 3.2 million of the 6.6, And that's why the number on line 132 is 3.4. So all of the numbers match. The mathematical calculations are correct. All right. Now, in the bottom section, we have a summary of the 1920 net savings, debits plus credits. And this is the summary of how we reached the 6.6 million, which was our final number. And then that 6.6, we deposited money in the ISF. We deposited the surplus from food and nutrition in the ISF, and we used room we had in the grants to roll money directly in the grants. And that's the grand total. And then we have a grand total of 6.6 million, which matches the surplus number. Right. Now, that 6.6 consists of debits at the top and various credits. In the credit section, the food and nutrition account ended with a surplus of $925,000. As you'll recall, we had been projecting initially a shortfall due to the lower revenue expectation, but I had indicated that they were doing everything possible to increase revenue and control expenditures, and in the end, we were able to turn a projected shortfall into a surplus. So the surplus is here, and then the potential liability of the $200,000 that I mentioned earlier is in the upper section, deducted, since it may materialize, or it may not. But if it does, we have accounted for it. If it doesn't, then those funds are available. And then there were other credits in the areas of transportation, substitute personnel, the AFSCME contract that I mentioned previously, and various end-of-year savings. We did well on legal services. We actually had savings on the legal services budget line of about $600,000. So that was a highly positive outcome. All right. So I could stop here, but I know it's 6:07 now. I do have some notes on variables that are going to impact 2021 that I would like to highlight briefly. And then I would like to mention important information on various grant appropriations that I think you will want to know and you'll find very, very useful. So I'll keep going if that's acceptable.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. So in terms of budget variables, I just want everyone to keep in mind, as I emphasize every year, that a budget is subject to change. It's subject to numerous variables, and at any point in time, any one of those variables can have either a moderate or a substantial impact, positive or negative, on a budget. So we just spoke about food and nutrition. Well, in the context of the hybrid education model, while daily food service counts currently are higher than in the March to June period, they're still lower than in traditional years. And so we still are confronting the issue of the level of revenue that will be generated. And in October, we'll have the data that we need to make initial projections of revenue versus expenditures, determine our forecast, and take appropriate action to work toward balance. On a positive note, the district has applied for a waiver to the federal government to continue, well, the waiver goes to the state, which then goes to the federal government. We've applied for a waiver to continue enrollment in the summer food service program as compared to the school breakfast and school lunch program through December 31st. And why are we doing this? Because this option will raise revenue. and be beneficial, of course, for our families. It will produce higher reimbursement rates per meal. It will permit weekend meals, which we know will be welcomed by our families, and allow meals to be served to all participants 18 years of age and under. So as we move into October, probably more toward the end of October, we'll have more information with which we'll be able to make reasonable initial projections. But that is an important factor, because if we project a shortfall again, and if this time a shortfall occurs, obviously we have to build that into our overall budget projection. We're also monitoring carefully facilities in terms of their overtime costs. We are applying to FEMA for reimbursement for any COVID-related overtime, and we do have a small appropriation in the CRF grant that I mentioned earlier for overtime costs. That was about $53,000, but we're anticipating that overtime, if cleaning services continue to be needed to a significant degree as we move through the year, that we have to take those expenses into account to the extent that they may exceed our original budget plan. Next would be special education. So you've heard me speak many times about the excess cost cap for out-of-district tuition. Well, in 1920, last year, it was 29.11%. It was up from 26.38%, so almost 3% higher. And that cap is not announced until February, and even when they announce it in February, they can still modify it in May. And so what is it? Well, it's the percentage of the balance paid by the district after we pay 4.5 times the NCEP. Okay? So for every child who's attending an out-of-district program in special ed, we have to pay 4.5 times the NCEP, the net current expenditures per student. And if there's a balance after that amount is paid, then in 1920 we had to pay 29.11% of the balance. So let's round that to 30% just to make the conversation simple. Then 70% would be paid by the state, and that would be in the excess cost grant that the state provides us. So the point is that we don't know what that cap is going to be, and initially we assumed stability. But suppose that cap is 32%. Well, that would be another 3% that we would have to pay. So we have to account for the possibility in our budget. Also, expenditures have been rising in special ed for new classes, for special ed transportation, for related services such as speech and psychology and resource services. So we have to always be mindful of that cost factor so that we can hopefully have sufficient reserves to or be able to take appropriate actions to redirect funding when necessary. Next would be Medicaid reimbursement. So tele-education services for students in remote learning are reimbursable only if they're one-to-one, audio, video, synchronous, and a minimum of 20 minutes. Now, compared to the spring term, we now have the hybrid model. And so we do have many students on site. But where children are potentially not on site, if they're in teleeducation, the services they're getting may or may not be eligible for Medicaid reimbursement. Also, the student has to be eligible and the parent consent has to be on file. So there could be a shortfall, but we don't have enough information at this point to know. All right. We actually did rather well in 1920 our final Medicaid level for 1920 was lower than the prior year by about $78,000. So while it was lower, which is not desirable, it was a relatively low number. And let's keep in mind, as I mentioned before, the AFSCME contract, which is pending. So there are 2 salary increases pending, and we have to plan for the retroactive increase as well as the current year increase. On the positive side, let's discuss for a moment the positive variables that could lower expenditures. I mentioned transportation. I said we had already built in to our GAP plan the 177 transportation days compared to 182, savings of 5 days. Keep in mind that on the negative side, we didn't have school for 5 days, so we lose some food service revenue for those days. And we've already applied those savings, most of those savings, to offset the loss of revenue in the state magnet grants and special ed expenditures. There could be some consolidation of routes, possibly, if feasible, but we don't know yet. We don't have any information yet at this point because we've been, quite frankly, focused on the opening of school issues. And so after September ends, we're going to look at the routes in comparison with last year and determine whether there's been any consolidation possible. There may not have been any consolidation possible because we're abiding by the guidelines in order to ensure safe and healthy transportation each day. So we're abiding by the limit for the number of students on a bus. But I'm just mentioning that there's always that possibility if it took place that it could generate some savings. Or there may be 1 or 2 or several additional routes that were necessary. So I don't have that information yet. We are going to be examining the routes in October to determine whether the costs have increased or decreased. And we may have savings in the current year in athletics and security and legal services again, perhaps. In the area of utilities, the winter of 2020, we will all remember, was relatively mild, resulting in lower costs for heating. And as we look ahead to the winter of 2021, I know we're all collectively hoping for a mild winter, but that is not guaranteed. So we may not have a similar outcome. And our intent is to secure savings in 2021, as we did in 1920, to the greatest extent possible, that we can carry forward to 21-22 to help close the gap in 21-22. Whether or not that will be achieved or not is yet to be seen. It is our goal, and that is why we remain in deficit prevention mode. We follow standard financial practices and standard operating procedures in order to expend only when necessary and essential. And finally, before I go to the grant section, the first formal fiscal forecast of the year, as in prior years, will be October 31st, and we'll plan to post a financial condition report in the first week of November. Okay. All right. Now, I would like also to give you some important information about our major grants. First, Title I. Title I, much to our surprise, was increased in 2021 by approximately $2 million. So that is very good news. I want to remind everyone that Title I is based on the prior year's enrollment. It's always a year behind. And our current enrollment in 2021, I've been told, I have not seen the enrollment reports yet, but I've been told that it's down. And so when we have the October 1 data, we'll be able to draw conclusions about the implications. But lower enrollment will ultimately impact Title I and other allocations probably a year or two into the future. So coming back to the current year, we have approximately $2 million. We have to spend at least 85%. We can roll up to 15%. And our plan is to leverage these resources with optimal benefit to fund district initiatives for non-recurring expenditures. And this will include the curriculum and technology renewal initiatives that have been planned in 2021 and looking ahead to 21-22. So for example, in our curriculum renewal cycle, next for literacy is 7 and 8. We completed this year grades 6, 7, and 4, 5, and 6. Excuse me. We did K-3 last year. This year, we've introduced Reading Wonders for grades 4, 5, and 6. And for 21-22, we're looking to do 7 and 8 and possibly 9 and 10. We're also looking at all of the high school grades to determine what the cost factors are to get the new course materials in the other courses as well. But we don't know those cost factors yet, so we don't know whether we'd be able to do all of the high schools for the in 21-22. But at a minimum, literacy will be 7 and 8, and we'd like to go to 9 and 10 if funding permits. For math, we had done in the prior year K1 and 2, and in the current year 6, 7, and 8. And now we have to go back to the middle and do 3, 4, and 5. And we're also looking at 9 and 10, and possibly 11 and 12. Now, we can use our Title I funds for K-8, but then we have the CARES Act, which allows for curriculum renewal on a digital platform, as well as equitable access to technology for distance learning. And so we're going to combine funding from multiple fund sources, from Title I, from the CARES Act, from the Priority Grant, from Impact Aid, from Title IV. We're going to take all of those fund sources, determine our balances, and hopefully be able to move forward with our curriculum initiatives. Now, moving ahead on Title I, also the estimated cost for one of these programs, for example, Math 3, 4, and 5, is about $1.1 million. So these are, it's certainly costly for the district to engage in curriculum renewal for multiple grades in any one subject, and that's why we have a curriculum renewal cycle where we try to do 1 or 2 subjects every year, and we're keeping track of our 6-year cycles for each subject and grade range. Now, curriculum proposals would be submitted to the board for approval in the February to March timeframe, perhaps even sooner, perhaps even in the January-February timeframe.
Hold on a second. Bobby, you got a question?
I think, is the page turned or is still on the same page? Are we still on the same spot?
No, I'm speaking about Title I.
Okay, because Albert was a little confused as to where we were, so I want to make sure I was following it correctly.
All right, sure, I understand. I'm just sharing some information.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
our Title I funds will also possibly be applied to other initiatives, such as the temporary paras in kindergarten or technology support. But now I want to move on to parent involvement, because I know that's a major subject that's of interest to everyone. And as a result of the increase in the appropriation, the methodology yielded a per capita of $8.73 per student. We had allocated $7 per student as the initial allocation. So after the budget plans are approved based on the initial allocations, we're going to place the additional funds on the instructional supply line for the schools, and everyone has been notified. We also rolled over $10,000 in unexpended funds in the Title I elementary school parent involvement budgets into the 2021 budget for central parent involvement activities, as we were asked to do by the board. And this is in addition to $18,000 for the annual parent conference, $9,000 from 1920 that wasn't used, plus another $9,000 in 2021. All right. And briefly, Title IIA was up as well by about 100,000. Title III bilingual was up by about 65,000. Title IV was up by about 100,000. We're applying those funds to our bullying prevention and chronic absenteeism programs and dropout prevention programs, as well as class sets of materials for specialized courses such as advanced placement. And our state bilingual grant was up by about 13,000 and IDEA by about 147,000. I want to remind everyone that when there's a grant increase and that grant includes staff, a significant portion of the increase is applied first to cover the escalated costs, the escalated personnel costs for salary growth and health insurance growth, as well as for non-certified staff, the pension contribution to MRF. And finally, we are going to leverage, as I mentioned earlier, all of our resources in order to achieve optimal utilization to meet our needs and expand rollover capacity for 21-22. And we remain in deficit prevention mode, which means stringent cost control and management. And through this mode, we hope to repeat our success of prior years. We capture accrued funds in all areas and strive to build reserves to support a balanced budget. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Siegel. That was very good. I got one question and maybe a point or whatever. What's a comfortable margin for an internal service fund? Comfortable cushion.
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question? I didn't hear any of it.
Sure. What is a comfortable cushion for the internal service fund? Because I know it's responsible to have a little money put aside, and with the size of our budget, what's a comfortable margin for you to have set aside for the internal service fund? Because I know people are going to be looking at it and say, oh, they got this much money left.
Well, let's understand what the internal service fund is. The internal service fund was established in order to be the depository for the premium cost share for health insurance from the employer and the employee, and to be the vehicle through which the expenditures for health insurance would be charged. In addition to health insurance, it includes workers' compensation. So the internal service fund receives the employer share of the premium cost share from the employee for health insurance, and it receives the employer share in every pay cycle. And we have scheduled in our budget the employer share. For the retirees, we schedule the amount that we're going to contribute as the employer share in the 850 account. It's called the 850 account in the operating budget, and that money flows into the internal service fund. And it has to be done that way because retirees are no longer active, so there isn't a pay cycle for them through which premium cost share can flow from the pay cycle to the internal service fund. So that's how the internal service fund is funded for the purpose for which it was established. It's the vehicle for keeping track of health insurance and workers' compensation expenditures. Now, in the case of the Connecticut Partnership, this is an insurance vehicle. So before we converted to the Connecticut Partnership, the Board of Ed and the city were self-insured. So when they were self-insured, they were responsible for all of the expenditures. If there were $1 million claims and the total amount of claims exceeded the revenue, meaning the cost share contributions, then the board and or the city in their respective areas were responsible for those excess expenses. Well, since 1819, we are in an insured environment, and that means we pay the fixed cost of the insurance. Now it goes up every year. It's not likely that it's going to stay stable. It'd be wonderful if it would stay stable, but it hasn't in my experience. And so the percentage growth in 21-22 is 5.8%. So it increases. But the insuring agency, in this case the state of Connecticut, is the responsible party for the full cost of the health insurance. So we don't have to be concerned about claims of substantial magnitude. All right. So I've explained the purpose of the ISF and the flow of revenue in and the expenditures that are paid against the revenue. Now, in any particular year, we're not anticipating a surplus in the case of basic health insurance. Why? Because, as I just explained, we're paying a fixed fee to the state of Connecticut. We're paying a premium, and that premium is divided between the employer and the employee. In the case of the retirees, we are contributing a fixed amount for all of the health insurance costs, which for the retirees gets a little more complex because while the partnership is applicable, we also have 65 plus individuals who are Medicare eligible, and some who aren't Medicare eligible, and then we have so the cost factors are a little more complex. But the point is that why would a surplus develop? Well, a surplus could develop in the ISF if the cost factors for the retirees are lower than anticipated, or if workers' comp is lower than anticipated. Okay, so we monitor the account through the year, because in those areas where I said there could be a surplus, there could also be a deficit. So we have to cover a potential. We have to be ready to cover a potential shortfall, as well as reap the benefits of a potential surplus. The $2 million that I mentioned was a surplus prior to the movement to the Connecticut Partnership. That $2 million resulted while the board was in a self-insured state. After July 1st of 2018, we went to an insurance state. All right. So the $2 million surplus is there. We're applying it in 2021 in our plan. Perhaps we won't need it, but we're applying it in the plan to achieve structural balance at this point in the year. And then beyond the 2 million, we deposited about $6 million, and of the money we deposited, we are applying in our plan about 3.2 million. Okay. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how high this ISF could go before.
Well, we can add, well, the point is that we don't know at the start of the year how the ISF
Right.
will end at the end of the year. We remain hopeful that it will end in a positive condition, right? And we actually had a small surplus from 1920, which is there in the ISF, and we're hopeful that in 2021 there will be a surplus, because I mentioned earlier that $2 million was deposited in the retiree account, whereas the original projection was about $1 million. That did exclude workers' comp, for which we do anticipate perhaps an increase. But there's the potential that 2021 could end with a surplus in the ISF. Perhaps it'll be 500,000, perhaps it will be higher. Or if workers' comp is significantly higher, it could be a shortfall. It's much too soon to make any accurate projections, but we're going to remain optimistic that at a minimum it will be stable, and at best there will be a surplus.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Brown, do you have any questions?
No, I don't have any questions.
Okay, Mr. Weldon?
Yeah. Ms. Siegel, at the onset of all of this, you remarked that we have a structurally balanced budget for the fiscal year ending 2021.
Yes.
Do you feel you're in a stable enough position to present this to the full board to get an approved budget? Or do you think there's more work to be done? I mean, understanding the budget is always in flux as the year progresses, but I mean, are you comfortable at this point to be able to seek an approval, or?
Well, we had an approved budget. This is now the updated plan. So I'm not sure we need board approval.
Well, the board has approved the FY 2021 budget. And that's based on your budget plan here. Historically, that's what we've done.
We can certainly present the gap plan the way that it was presented this evening, if that's what you're requesting.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
If you're asking if the gap plan can be presented, it can be presented virtually as we've done this evening. Right. And I think that's the way we've always done it in the past, is the gap plan. So with this gap plan, the budget is structurally balanced. Am I understanding that correctly? Yes. Okay. So, and I think that's what we've typically done, is we've taken the gap plan and used it as the mechanism to approve a quote unquote balanced budget for the fiscal year. And I'm just asking if you'd be comfortable at this point
presenting this to the full board, or is there other work that you think needs to be done to present it more at the committee level?
No, this is the plan that we are
Okay.
working. This is our platform, and
Okay.
we're moving ahead. We're past the point of achieving the structurally balanced budget. We're at the point now where we are engaged in our forecasting process, and we are working on 2021 in terms of the fiscal forecast, moving towards the first formal fiscal forecast as of October 31st. And proceeding with all of the necessary expenditures for curriculum, technology that are required in 2021 and planning for 21-22.
Okay. All right. All right, then I'll talk with Mr. Testani about doing that. Again, it would be virtual, but it is something that we are going to need to do for you guys to be able to carry forward and actually use this plan.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Benahan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Siegel, I know you really give information, and I don't want you to go back again about the $2 million for 2021, the Title I, and everything about the parent convention. I know you use Reporter, but I don't see it in the screen. Do you have that document the same way you have it here, so we can have it, like a black and white, like I say?
We're in the process of compiling all of the data, so it was too soon this evening to have a formal chart ready. We're in the process of compiling the data on 2021 grant appropriations.
All right, please, when you have that ready, and for the record, can you email it to me? I'd like to have it, please, when you get a chance.
Yes, it's being developed over the next week or two.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Siegel. That's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Testani has joined the meeting, and he's got his hand up. Superintendent.
Yeah, I was meeting with the BEA. Sorry for my tardiness. I just wanted to stress that the curriculum renewal is a priority of the administration to put us in a updated position with all our online digital resources going forward. We are going to put together a committee to look at our high school and middle school history programs. As Ms. Siegel mentioned, we're going on 6 years. We have a solid team of principals and assistant principals at our high schools that were all exceptional social studies teachers. So we're going to move in that direction. As you know, we haven't had a lead in that department in many years. So and the math and the ELA curriculum renewals are going to be extremely important to us this budget cycle, put us in a much better position for the uncertainty that we have going forward. As we all know, we don't know what this next budget cycle from the city and from the state based on COVID lost revenues may bring us in funding, but while we have some opportunity here, we like to solidify these areas this year rather than put them off for next year.
Sounds absolutely prudent. Is there any other questions? Anything else? Oh, who's speaking? Any more questions? Any more information?
I'm okay with no question, Mr. Chair.
Me too.
Anything else? Anything else you'd like to add, Ms. Siegel?
No, thank you very much.
Okay, everybody, I think that about covers it. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
I'll second that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, everybody, thank you very much, Ms. Siegel and team. As usual, very professional, very thorough. Everybody, thank you for all your hard work and your attendance. Have a great evening, and I'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank
God
you.
bless you all.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.